And what I do in the book is to show we have in ethics, we have a very similar axiomatic starting point, which is called the axiom of argumentation, or also the a priori of argumentation. We cannot deny that we can argue, engage in a discussion with each other, because if we would deny this, then we would already be engaged precisely in argumentation. So we have a firmly established starting point, a starting point that cannot possibly be denied as being a starting point beyond which you cannot possibly go. Once we have the starting point of we have to argue with each other, it follows that no statement, no proposition that denies this starting point can possibly be defended, or we can also say that whatever must be taken for granted insofar as we engage in discussions with each other cannot again be disputed in terms of its validity, because if we would dispute it, then we are engaged in what is called a performative contradiction. The content of our statement would be contradicted by the very fact of making this statement. And the second thing I do is to delineate what the task of ethics is. The task of ethics is conflict avoidance or peaceful cooperation, and we are confronted with the possibility of conflicts because there exists scarcity. And in order to solve the problem of how can we avoid conflicts given the fact of scarcity, it is obviously required that we must have exclusivity rules, or rules of property that assign the right to control scarce resources to one person rather than to another. So scarcity is one of the requirements, or one of the requirements of having ethical problems, and the other requirement for having ethical problems is the fact that we must have rational entities being involved in conflicts, entities that can argue and discuss with each other. A further requirement for any type of ethics is it must be discipline that formulates rules which are universalizable. That is to say, all people, all arguers must be capable in principle of agreeing to these rules. And a further requirement for any type of ethics is we must formulate rules that allow us to act from the very beginning of mankind on. That is, we must be able to start right away. And the solution to this problem is well known in these circles. That is, we must have self-ownership. We must be owners, exclusive owners of our own physical bodies in order to be able to engage in argumentation. If I don't own myself and I would not recognize the self-ownership of my opponents in an argument, then obviously we could not possibly engage in I say this, you say something else, and so forth, and arguing back and forth. So self-ownership cannot possibly be denied as a valid principle without falling into a contradiction. And the second rule is we must have the right to appropriate previously unowned resources. If we would not have the right to acquire the right of exclusive control of previously unowned resources, then we would all die out. And if we would all die out, then obviously no ethical problem would exist whatsoever. So two principles are entirely sufficient in order to come up with a theory of property rights that cannot possibly be disputed by anyone. The right to own ourselves, our own body, and the right to acquire previously unowned resources and acquire thereby exclusive control over these resources. And these two principles are by no means just conventions. Conventions are rules for which we have alternatives, so to speak. A convention is, for instance, that we use the Latin alphabet when we engage in written communication with people. And we have an alternative to these conventions. We can also use the Cyrillic alphabet, for instance. But the rules that I mentioned, self-ownership and ownership in originally appropriated resources, there is no alternative to them if we understand that the purpose of ethical rules is to avoid any type of conflict and to allow people to act from the very beginning of mankind on. No other rules can possibly achieve this result of conflict-free interaction except these two rules. Just a few words about other things that you find in this book, besides these purely abstract inquiries about the foundations of ethics. I have a number of applied investigations on money, for instance, and there I show the importance of the distinction between money as property on the one hand and property titles. That is tickets that show you to be the owner of a certain piece of property. And once you introduce the distinction between money as property and property titles, then you come to a correct assessment of the legal quality of fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking is nothing else but an increase in the number of property titles without an increase in the quantity of property in existence, which in all other cases would be, of course, considered to be a fraudulent thing to do. You increase the number of titles to a car without having additional cars available, from which it clearly follows that practices like this should be considered illegal. I have a chapter on Hayek where I criticize Hayek's contribution to the so-called calculation debate. I believe that the mistake that Hayek makes, in contrast to the correct views that Mises espouses, is to consider the fundamental problem of socialism, the fact that certain information is unavailable to people, and that you cannot concentrate all sorts of knowledge in one person's head. And I try to show that the truly fundamental problem of socialism is rather the fact that there exists no private property, and only because there exists no private property, certain types of information are by definition then not available, namely the information about prices. I have chapters on the origin of states, and the inclination of states, or the tendency of states to engage in war and imperialism, and in particular also some interesting remarks about what I call monetary imperialism, that is the setting up of institutional arrangements that allow some states to exploit the population of other states without going to war through systems such as the Bretton Woods system, and the practice of client states to use the currency of other states as their own reserve currency. With that, I conclude, and I